Good. I'm already intimidated.
Okay, the recording is in progress. Okay. And I think we can start exactly on time with the introduction so that by the time you start speaking, it'll be 3-4 minutes past.
As you wish, I'm here. I'm trying to minimize the reflection on my glasses.
I think we've got quorum and we can begin. Hello and welcome to Empowering the Truth Summit. This is a series. It's run by the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ, in association with us at Boom Live. We're fact checkers based in India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And this is for the region of South Asia and Southeast Asia. But this is open to everyone around the world. And in previous sessions, we've had people logging in from different parts of the world. So welcome to everyone. And today we have a real treat coming up. It's a masterclass on podcasting, but really it's also a masterclass on the idea of really connecting with people through the interface of audio. It's also a masterclass on earning the trust of your listeners so they are disposed to listen to your perspective on fact checking, or on verified information, on journalism, and so much more. And the person to take us through all of this is Amit Varma. Amit Varma is, of course, the host of The Seen and the Unseen, which is probably, I think, among the most famous podcasts you will find anywhere in the world. And here it is. This is my screen. This is what's coming up in the next few minutes. And before I toss it over to Amit, a quick look at where we are and where we've come from and what's ahead as well. So let me, and next week, next Thursday is Design Basics for journalists who want to spread facts. That's Rishad Patel of Splice Media. And then after that, we have Alan Soon, strategic communication, tying up really everything we've learned on getting your overall strategy right. And here's what we've started with. We started with the wonderful Dr. Masato Kajimoto. He spoke about how might we make the truth viral. We spoke about social platforms, how to reach them, what tactics to use with Shohini Guharoy. And then we had a masterclass on mobile video by Manon Varsho and Sanjay Biswas. That was last week. And today it is Amit Varma. And I'm super excited. Amit, thanks so much for making it. And it's all over to you. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here. I'll quickly share my screen if I can. I can't share my screen while you are sharing your screen. Excellent. I'll just quickly share my screen. Can you see this?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll start. Before I start, thank you for inviting me for this. When, Venkatesh told me about the focus on empowering truth and fighting fake news and so on. And I was like, what's the connection between that and podcasting? But as I thought about it, I realized that actually they're intimately connected. The form of podcasting per se is incredibly powerful. Especially in this context. So I'm going to sort of expound on that today, and as soon as I can get my slideshow to move, one sec, I will do this. Yes. So this is sort of the contents. I'll start by talking about why fake news has always been a problem, but is more of a problem in modern times, and how we can fight it in general. And then I will take you through sort of my little podcasting. I wouldn't call it a master class. I think Venkatesh is sort of being too kind, but I'll sort of take you through my learnings on podcasting over the years that I have been doing the seen and the unseen and the other little experiments that I have tried. And all of it is, I think, relevant to empowering truth, as it were. So let's kind of get started. There's a lot of material, and I intend to wrap this up in about 40 minutes, and then we go on for a Q&A, which can go on for as long as you like. So as we know, fake news has always been with us. These are like a few random examples that I came up with, or rather, not I came up with, ChatGPT came up with. I just asked ChatGPT, give me 15 examples of fake news, and then 15 more. And then I said, give me 15 based in India. And it told me demonetization, which is very interesting. It hallucinates in a bit, but in interesting directions, where bad policy can also be fake news. But the truth is that fake news has always been with us, because our knowledge of the world is always incomplete. The world is complex. In a sense, every narrative that makes sense of the world is, kind of fake news, in the sense that it is never complete. It is never the whole truth. And the whole truth is impossible. I mean, there's a short story by Borges about how if you want to build a good map of the world, it has to be as big as the world itself. And obviously, in one moment, it is then redundant, because the world is constantly changing. But anyway, regardless of all that, fake news has always been with us. But the problem is worse today because of technology and social media. We live in an age of narrative battles where, often it seems that the truth does not matter, that the truth is an accident when it comes up. But basically, we are fighting for our tribe, and there are great incentives for tribalism. Social media makes this worse. You go online, you obviously want to belong. That's a natural human urge for community and validation. You might join whichever ideological tribe seems closest to you, and then all the incentives drive you towards extremism. You raise your status within your tribe by attacking people on the other side, never arguments, only people, by sort of attacking people on your own side for not being pure enough, and the incentives are towards the extremes, and therefore that leads to greater polarization, and therefore the truth suffers, because you might go in there with good intentions, but once you have supported one tribe, it is always that the other party can never do anything good, your party can never do anything bad, and so on and so forth, and this becomes a problem. And also there are many more sources of fake news, and I mean, this is a good thing. The means of production are available to all of us. The mainstream is broken down, but this means that there is no consensus on the truth. If you think back to the 80s, to the 90s, whatever fake news did spread was, very sort of very niche. The one could say religion is not niche, and that's also fake news. But leaving that blasphemy aside, one could say that there was a broad consensus on the truth with minor differences on the margins. Today, that the mainstream has vanished and the consensus on the truth has kind of vanished, and on the whole, it's a good thing, because a lot of us are therefore empowered to seek our own truth, to put our voices out there, while earlier we could not have been able to do that because of elite gatekeepers and so on. And in general, it is a good thing. But one aspect of it that is worrying is that there is more and more fake news around us in these narrative battles. And like, how do we navigate our way through this? Now, um, uh, my belief is that fact checking alone cannot solve the problem. We believe what we want to believe, right? And it goes back to making sense of the world. The world is complex. We have narratives in our head that help us make sense of it in different ways. We have frames of looking at the world, and anything that goes against these frames, which are always necessarily a little simplistic, we will reflexively resist it. So we will essentially choose our facts, right? Or choose our alternative facts, as it were. It's a human tendency. That's a problem. And the other problem is that we are constantly scrolling, always swiping, chasing dopamine. And this also becomes a big problem, in the sense that one of the great observations about sort of the deluge of content that we are presented with came from Jonathan Haidt, when he said that, even if we feel that the internet gives us all of knowledge, everything ever created is available to us, but we are all consuming something that was produced in the last 3 days. It's all dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. You're scrolling, swiping. That's what you're doing, and you take in everything that confirms your beliefs, and anything that goes against your beliefs can actually, and this is something that cognitive scientists and behavioral economists have spoken about, that when you're presented facts that contradict what you believe in, that might actually strengthen your belief as you sort of fight back. So it's very hard to combat fake news with fact checking, because fake news will often be sensational and simplistic, and that gets us going. And fact checking will always be sort of nuanced and so on. So it's just much harder. It doesn't propagate at the same speed. My contention is that we need to build a skeptical mentality, right? If you just fight every alternative fact with a real fact, I don't think that's enough. What we need is for all of us to have a mentality where we automatically question everything, where we are not bound by certainties, where we are open to other ideas, and this might go against what one expects on social media, but where one doesn't have to have an opinion on everything. You can reserve your judgment till you know enough about it, right? And I believe that there is hope for this, because people do crave depth, right? We might be impulse monkeys, as it were, but many of us know we are impulse monkeys. We try to mitigate it, and this is something and I'll talk about this, but I realized, especially while doing my podcast and as we got into long form podcasting and so on and so forth, that uh, people have this intense craving for depth that we contain multitude. So there are times where I am impulse monkey, I'm scrolling, I'm swiping, I'm doing all of those things. But a lot of there are also times where I want to, sit down, read a book, or sit down, immerse myself in something for an hour or two and try to understand it. And and there are, I think almost all of us contain both these multitudes, right? And The question then is that how do you give this depth to people in times where everything seems to be catering for a short attention span? And my answer is podcasting. Podcasting is the perfect medium to build that skeptical mentality. So I'm over the next few slides sort of going to talk about why that is so and talk about podcasting in general. But here's a sort of a key insight I have got from the work I've done podcasting and in the creator economy, which is at the center of this. That is, which is that the form that you work in or consume shapes the content, and that shapes you, right? So in a consumption sense, if you're all the time scrolling and you're taking things in 10-second bites, you are never going to get that kind of deep knowledge. You're never going to immerse yourself in anything to really understand it. And if you just do this throughout, if you do this all day, you won't grow. Your future self would be perhaps stupider or less informed than she otherwise would be. Whereas if we manage to embrace deep work, and instead of reaching for a smartphone when we are bored, if we reach for a book and read, or if we keep time aside where we don't give in to these online temptations, then that brings a certain kind of terror, that brings a considered attitude, and that shapes who you are as a reader. And this is also true of creators. Like a 5-minute podcast is so different from a 5-hour podcast. In a 5-minute podcast, if I'm talking to someone, I don't need to have read their book. I don't even need to know much about them. I can just ask 2-3 potted questions and be done with it. If I'm doing a 5-hour, or I've done some 8-hour episodes recently with Shanta Gokhale and Jerry Pinto, and if I'm doing that kind of a project, I can't wing it, right? I firstly, I have to listen deeply. Not listen, not just to respond, but listen to understand. And I'll elaborate more on this later on. And that changes the kind of sort of the engagement that I have. That changes the kind of preparation that I do. That changes the kind of reading that I do, and that changes me. I become a different person, right? So in both what we consume and what we create, the form matters, and audio in general and podcasting in particular allow for that depth. They incentivize that depth. Let's talk about audio quickly. Why is audio special? Number one, consider when people tend to listen to audio. And this is really something that's happened in the last 12, 13 years since the smartphones since smartphones came into our life. We tend to listen when we are commuting, when we are working out, when we are doing errands. Now, what this means is that we are a captive audience. So if I'm watching a YouTube video on my laptop, I can switch to another of the 800 tabs I will usually have open. I can turn my head and talk to someone. I can, pick up a book lying there. My mind can wander in different ways. But if I'm jogging outside, right, I'm not going to keep switching from one thing to another. I've made myself a captive audience, and for that duration, I am committed to what I am doing. And this means that people will typically have longer user sessions, to use a technical term, when they are consuming audio content. The reader becomes a captive, the listener becomes a captive audience. Consider how you listen. We usually listen at higher speeds. The brain can comprehend language at 500 words a minute, but we tend to speak at about 150 to 200 words a minute. I'm middle-aged, I'm a bit slow, so I speak at about 160 words a minute. And for those of you, by the way, who listen to my podcast at higher speeds, apologies for speaking at 1x, what to do. And initially, when I started listening to podcasts, I thought, hey, can't listen at a higher speed, it'll be squeaky and all of that. But really, you take it to 1.2x, let that normalize, take it to 1.5, let that normalize. You'll find that our brain adapts, and it just sounds normal. We don't miss anything. We don't miss any nuance. We miss nothing. It's just the brain just adapts. I did an episode with Krish Ashok, in fact, where he told me about a visually impaired colleague of his in office, who, because he was visually impaired, used to listen to everything, and he could listen at 6x. I would not be able to do that, but the brain has that capacity. So you have a captive audience, which is listening at often double speed, if you're a regular listener. So your 2-hour podcast, if you record it, is getting over in like 1 hour. That's a standard commute in many cities. My Bangalore friends complain it's much longer for them, but I'm like, traffic is a good thing for podcasters. Thank you. So, Also consider why you listen. It's the most efficient way to consume deep content. Now, I had once done an episode on education with Karthik Mullitharan, one of my most popular episodes, and that was 3 hours 15 minutes, right? Which means you can listen to it in 1 hour 40 minutes or so, right? And Karthik speaks fast, and he had that episode transcribed, and it came to about 45,000 words, right? That's like a short book. 45,000 words. In 1.5 hours, you're consuming 45,000 words of directed content. And in your daily life, you may not have the time to actually sit down with a book, consume that much, and your reading speed may not be that high, but you're getting that directed content in that time. It's an incredibly efficient way to consume deep content. Now, this is audio. Specifically, why is podcasting different from other forms of audio? Like at one level, it might seem that podcasting is a Netflix of audio, right? Radio and television, you have to watch it at particular times, but these are on demand. Netflix and podcasts are on demand. There are other subtle differences, though. Radio tends to be broad, and therefore it tends to be shallow. Like one metaphor I really which I heard a long time ago, was imagine in an audio visual medium, you are sitting in a cinema theater, and there's a certain distance between you and the screen, and there's a similar distance between the camera and the actor. So you have your grand westerns and your car chases and all that, a lot of space. Uh, a television is like a couple of meters away from you, and there's a similar distance between the camera and the actors. So you have your indoor dramas like Friends and Seinfeld and all of that. YouTube brings it closer. It's in a laptop in front of you or a phone in your hand, and YouTube content often is similarly shot that way, where the camera is pretty close to the actor. Now, taking this to audio, radio is broad. You might think of radio as radio's playing in a car and there are 5 people in it, and it's got to cater to all of them, right? And that's what sort of radio is. That is the incentives that radio has, that you've got to cater to large audiences. Very often your license fees, like in India for FM, your license fees are so high that they can't create a niche, they can't cater to a niche, right? And catering to a niche is one thing. Often you don't even discover a niche is there. Like 20 years ago, would anyone have thought that that there is a huge market of people out there who are willing to listen to 5 hour podcasts? If I went to a gatekeeper at a radio station and said I want to do 5 hour interviews, I would have been laughed out of the room. Nobody even knew that that audience existed. And radio can never even discover that audience, because it has to follow the incentives and cater to all of that. But podcasting allows you to go deep. Podcasting is really intimate. If radio is blasting in the car, podcasting is a voice in your head. Now, this allows you to find your 1,000 True Fans. For those of you who are not familiar, 1,000 True Fans is an essay written by Kevin Kelly about 12, 13 years ago, where he said that creators in the new age will no longer need to scale. Right? Earlier, what used to be is that in any creative field, the people at the very top make a huge amount of money, but everyone else is basically poor, and you have to do side jobs and all of that to kind of get by. And that, his contention was that, hey, that's not true. That you don't need to scale, that you can find, if you find 1,000 people who pay you $100 a year, that's 100,000 a year. That's pretty decent, right? And and at that time, people kind of laughed at it. Today, it's clearly coming true. Your $100 a year is like a standard price on Substack, for example, where so many unknown people who would have been rejected by gatekeepers actually now make enormous amounts of money and have many more than 1,000 True Fans, and some at higher prices. In fact, there's a lady who wrote this great essay called 100 True Fans, where she said that you could actually find 100 True Fans to pay you $1,000 a year, and arrive at the same kind of revenue. And podcasting allows that because of the intimacy, right? Because you are a voice in someone's head. They feel like they know you. Like someone once remarked on an episode I did with Abhinandan Sekri, that I felt so much that I am sitting with two friends in my living room talking to them, that at one point I interrupted you till I realized I wasn't there. And that's such a beautiful compliment. And I get get told similar things, that the last 4 or 5 times I've had outstation trips, I've just been stopped at the airport every single time by somebody saying, you are so and so, thank you for what you do, which is very touching, and I'm grateful for that. But it speaks to that intimacy, that they feel they know you so well, they can come and talk to you, right? And as far as niches are concerned, every niche has high absolute numbers, especially in India. But the point is that if you just look at existing niches, you're getting nowhere. The thing to do is to start to throw things at the wall and figure out where to go from there. And this is such an intimate medium, and that leads to such deeper engagement. Like, I think a mistake advertisers make, and something that they haven't figured out yet, is they will look at absolute numbers. And instead of looking at absolute numbers, I think you also have to look at engagement. Like, I often say that I would rather have 100,000 listeners of an episode than 10 million views for a YouTube video I might do. And the reason is that on YouTube, your average session time may sometimes be as less as a few seconds, whereas the average session time of the Seen and the Unseen is 40 minutes, which is off the charts. If you told me this 15 years ago when I was an internet professional, I would have said you're making it up. It's only possible for perhaps really popular video games. But today, long form podcasts routinely get that kind of session time, and people will, of course, listen over multiple sessions, and that's an average. So the engagement is incredibly high, and the for audio podcasting, and the numbers don't often kind of reflect that. Also, podcasting has no entry barriers. You don't need a license to start a podcast, and I hope these are not famous last words. If the powers that be, or perhaps another Amit is listening, they might get a brainwave, but let's hope not. And the tech is advanced and affordable. I will elaborate on that later in this session itself. You are limited only by your imagination and desire. And when I say this, you can literally start with a cell phone. That's really all you need. And even the kind of equipment that I use, like you see this little mic thing in front of me right now and whatever, is incredibly affordable. And I'll talk about that later in the session. So I want to talk about the two dominant forms of podcasting, and which are storytelling and conversations or interviews. And I'll begin by talking about storytelling. And I want to wrap this up, I think, in another 25 minutes. So I'll kind of go quickly through this, but I think you'll get the point. Robert McKee, the great storyteller, once said, story is the natural form of thought. That's how we make sense of the world. We tell ourselves stories about it, that, oh, there is a noise in the bushes, it may be a tiger. I'm just thinking back to how our sort of brains evolved. But audio storytelling is the earliest form of storytelling, because you can't store anything. There's no writing, there's nothing. So we have our brains have evolved to audio storytelling and the forms that it takes. And it is also obviously the most intimate, because what happens when you are reading something or when you're watching something is that a lot of stuff is laid out for you, and the imagination does less work. Perhaps it does the least work in the visual medium. If you're consuming virtual reality, perhaps even less than that. um, you know um, Maybe future forms of entertainment will have direct links to your brain, so it can just make you feel a particular way. But audio storytelling is the most primitive and therefore the most intimate, because there's the most room for imagination, right? You're always using your imagination about how somebody looks, how they act, all of that. And so it's important to remember that we are so used to thinking of entertainment and storytelling in terms of the written word, the visual medium, that we don't realize that the one that is most intrinsic to us and in which we are storytelling all day is actually audio. Now, tip number one is, when you're doing audio, and I'm giving practical sort of tips here for all of you who want to start rather than just talk at a theoretical level. These are some of my learnings. Tip number one is, you need to keep it simple, because we listen to stories in a linear way, one piece of information at a time. When you're reading something, you can go back and forth. If you haven't understood a sentence, you can go back. Though, of course, one should not write like that either, where you're making the person go back. But at least that option is there. But we listen in a linear way, one piece of information at a time, and therefore the storytelling has to take that into account. Don't overload the listener with complicated sentences. For example, consider this sentence. The famous podcaster Amit Varma, while conducting a webinar on writing from his home office in Andheri, Mumbai, was arrested by the Delhi police for the crime of making Delhi more polluted by broadcasting his convoluted classes there, right? Now, this is not a good sentence for print either, but at least for print, you'll see sentences like this a lot, but it's terrible for audio because there are just too many pieces of information that are coming at you in one sentence that the listener has to process. Famous podcaster Amit Varma conducting a webinar from home in Mumbai, arrested by Delhi police for the crime. It just, it's just hard to process. So a quicker way of breaking it down is something like this. A famous podcaster Amit Varma is behind bars. The Delhi police came to Mumbai to pick him up. He was charged with blah, blah, blah. So you're not dumbing it down. All the information is there, but you're presenting it in a way which makes it easier to understand in the audio medium, because here you don't have the support of visuals and the reader can't go back here last sentence mein kya bola. So you need to sort of be aware of how the listener is consuming your content. So you build the story with simple nuggets one at a time. Don't clutter the listener's mind and demand too much of them, and avoid dependent clauses. What is a dependent clause? No, it's not a member of your family who's not earning. Instead, it is something like this: Amit Varma, while continuing to conduct a webinar from his mobile phone while in the police van, protested his blah blah blah, one of whom he berated for using an adverb. And the dependent clause is, of course, what comes after the comma, and it's just confusing because you have too much to keep track of in your head. So when you're in audio, and remember that this is not dumbing down, you can present the same information without losing anything, without compromising on the content, in a form that's easier to understand. Now, tip number 2, structure is important. Our brain thinks in patterns. Conventional structures exist for a reason. So your typical 3-act structure, setup, confrontation, resolution, it's a cliche, right? Sitfield has written so many books with that structure and how you write a screenplay, and there'll be other structures that will evolve. But these structures exist for a reason. They exist because the fundamental thing that a story has to do is it has to captivate the reader at the start, make the reader empathetic for the characters, make her curious about what's going to happen next. And there are certain structures where it works, and there are certain structures where it doesn't work. And this is a general rule, right? Now, if you read literary fiction, everything has been tried. There is no structure, and that's great. So whatever you're creating will have its own natural structure to it, and that's perfectly fine. But when you're thinking of effective storytelling, it's important to keep that structure in mind. Kurt Vonnegut once said every character should want something, even if it is only a glass of water, which is again great advice. Tip number 3, show don't tell, applies to writing, applies to audio as well. Abstract terms are boring. The listener can get distracted. Like, let's say that you go and have coffee with a friend of yours called Karan, and I'm like, oh, you had coffee with Karan, tell me something about Karan. And you say that Karan is wonderful, Karan is mind-blowing, Karan is awesome. This conveys no information, because these adjectives, mind-blowing, awesome, they can mean everything, and therefore they mean nothing, right? But if you tell me that, oh, Karan could see I was feeling low, so he stood on his head and sang the national anthem backwards to cheer me up. Now, this is show don't tell. It immediately shows me so much about Karan, that he's empathetic, that he can stand on his head. It tells me something about the national anthem as well, that it can be sung backwards. So show don't tell doesn't mean you describe something. It means that, in a sense, it means the opposite. Show don't tell depends on verbs and nouns. Nouns name the world, verbs activate them. You're using verbs, you're showing action. You could say that, that Amit sat for an hour looking out of the window feeling sad, right? Or you can say that Amit sat looking out of the window for an hour as a cup of tea he was holding grew cold and he hadn't taken a sip. And that kind of conveys that same melancholic mood. And this was just an off the top of my head example. So even in audio, make it vivid, paint pictures, let there always be action, things happening, avoid abstract terms. Storytellers use a term called pet the dog, that early in a story, you want the character to have a pet the dog moment, because when you show a character petting a dog, it indicates, oh, this is the kind of person who sort of is an empathetic person, warm human being. So you need a pet the dog moment. And I think, which show was it? There was a show a while back that actually used this device literally, where this guy goes to kill somebody, but he sees him petting a dog, so he doesn't kill him because, hey, he must be a nice guy. Um, Another example I use in the writing course that I teach, which is, by the way, called the Art of Clear Writing. It's you can sort of look that up. My April cohort starts soon. JBS Haldane, the scientist, shifted to India when he was in his mid-60s, and he spent the rest of his life here. So he was asked that, boss, why did you shift to India? You lived all your life in England. Why India so late? And he could have said, I wanted to live a simple life unconstrained by convention. Instead, what he said was, I don't want to wear socks anymore. 60 years in socks is enough, right? And it's so beautiful because it's so relatable. Nobody likes wearing socks unless you're kind of kinky and you wear it on your head while doing unspeakable things, but let's not go there. But nobody likes wearing socks. So people immediately get the vibe that the man wants to chill. And you look at pictures of his last years in India, he is indeed chilling. You've got him in a shirt and pajamas, you've got him in a banyan and a dhoti, not a sock in sight, right? So always try to make it vivid for your listeners. And sound can also show. You can use the voices of others. You can use simple sound design, like if somebody is waiting for someone else at a park, you can just have the sound of footsteps, so you kind of know that it's coming. If somebody is woken up suddenly at night, you can have the sound of a knife being unsheathed, or the trigger of a gun, or whatever. And examples to look up where this has worked very well: the Ballad of John Axon, which was sort of a radio drama made in the 50s and considered a classic. And basically, I think these songwriters had been commissioned to write a song about a guy who had died in a train accident. He was a train driver, and the train wasn't stopping. So he could have jumped off and saved himself, or he could have tried his best to stop it to save other lives, with the risk that he himself would die, and he died. And the producers went and spoke to all his family, and they got background info and all of that from them, and they never intended to use it, but then they ended up using it. Because then, instead of saying that, oh, John was John was known to be a warm person by his family, you can have his sister talking about how John helped her when he was a little kid and got her a dog, or whatever. So there's also a great 90s radio drama called Son of the Family. You can look it up. A lot of stuff happening here as well. Beware the curse of knowledge when it comes to audio. Too often we know the story so well, so we just go on telling it, but the listener doesn't know the story as well as you do. And so you need to set up scenes clearly. This is an audio medium. They're not remembering everything, so you need to set up scenes clearly, have clear transitions if you're shifting from one location to another. Keep re-engaging listeners. Tip number 5: define what the story is. Are you the main narrator? Which is perfectly fine. Are you a facilitator for other characters? Also perfectly fine. Are you the story? Which is also perfectly fine. You can put yourself at the center of the story by talking about how doing the story changes you. That's legitimate. All of these are fine. But the important thing is you need to define it. And that definition will help you craft the story better and will not confuse your listener at any point that what are we listening to, what's going on here, and so on and so forth. In audio, no reverse gear, because a listener cannot go back to the previous sentence to see what happened. So don't make them reverse. Don't use passive voice. Passive voice would be something like active voice always begins with a subject and a verb. So like, Amit conducted a great webinar, right? That's active voice. But passive voice would be, a great webinar was conducted by Amit, where mentally, when you reach the end of the sentence, your mind takes a moment to pass that, oh, Amit conducted a great webinar, because you've put the subject at the end. So you want to avoid that. And when you're attributing, try to attribute at the start of a sentence so the listener isn't confused. It's become a kind of convention for some constructed podcasts to, introduce a character by having a quote, and then the narrator will say that so and so is, professor of psychology at blah blah blah, which works. But in general, remember that you don't want to make the reader wonder what the hell is going on. So often things like attributions, do them at the start. And sound adds depth. Sound design can add texture to your story, but never be intrusive. So like I pointed out, if you're if you have someone waiting at a park and the sound of footsteps. That's okay. But sometimes you get carried away, just as, beginning writers will get carried away with the beautiful things you can do with language. But that sparkling prose can come in the way of the story. So you don't want to be intrusive with the sound design. You want it to be natural. You want to ask, what is it doing here? I often say in writing about sentences that every sentence should either go forward or it should go deeper. One of these two things. So it's a similar thing with sound effects, that it should do one of these two things: take the narrative forward or give you additional context or mood or vibe also, which is a legit reason for doing it. But it has to have a purpose, and you have to know what purpose it is. And also, my final story tip before we go on to talking about interviews: one person is enough. Solo storytelling can work. A great example of this is Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, where he has the series that introduced me to that show was called Countdown to Armageddon, a blueprint for Armageddon, which is about World War One. So that's 5 episodes of about 5 hours each, total of 25 hours. No sound effects, nothing, just a person talking, right? And talking in his own voice, nothing fancy. And it is incredible. It's so riveting. So you don't actually need any sound effects, any music, nothing. You can just start on your own. Just keep it authentic. You don't have to script it. I'm looking at the time and it's 11:37, but I think I'll take at least till 11:50, but the Q&A will be unlimited. So the art of the interview now, and something that I have actually thought a lot about, because this is really what my show, The Scene and the Unseen, is about: the art of the conversation, in a sense, and has evolved from being a 10-minute show to being an 8-hour show. Though not all my episodes are 8 hours, 4 to 5 hours is more standard. One, you can see I do this. Ignore all limits. You can go as deep as you want. You can go as long as you want. I've given the reasons for this before. People are captive audiences listening at higher speeds, and they crave depth. So don't be limited by conventions anywhere. And that's advice that really holds true for any medium that you're working in. That don't feel limited by conventions. Think about what you want to do, and whatever form that demands, go for it. Don't second guess what others want. Ignore convention. To define your purpose. Are you a fox or a hedgehog? Isaiah Berlin wrote this famous essay called About Foxes and Hedgehogs, where a fox knows many things kind of well. A hedgehog knows one thing really, really well. So define what you are doing in the overall context of your podcast series, if you're doing one, or in the context of a particular sort of episode that you're doing. It's a trade-off between breadth and depth, and there's always a trade-off. If you stay broad and cover a lot of things, you can't cover any of them in depth. So it's a difficult trade-off. If you're too broad, then specialists will say, hey, kuch depth hi nahi tha, and you got this wrong or you got that wrong. If you go too deep into one thing, you could others might feel that they don't actually have an overview of the subject. So you need to think about what you're doing. And you also need to define that: do you want to know more about a subject or a field or a guest? So if Ramchandra Guha has written a book on Gandhi, my first 2 episodes with him were on Gandhi. I wanted to know more about the subject. Then I did episodes with him on history and and how it relates to contemporary India, and that's like a field. And then, the last episode I did with him, which is the 5th episode I did with him, was just about him. It was personal, because I had evolved from deep dives about subjects to deep dives about people. And it's a beautiful episode where you really relate to the man that he is, his vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. And there's no right or wrong here. It depends on what do you want to do. You have to figure out, but define it clearly. Otherwise, it gets confusing and can be confusing for listeners as well. And be clear with the guest as well what you are aiming for. Tip 3: establish tone. Set a baseline in terms of the tone at the start of the conversation, so you're on the same page. Your aim is to have a conversation, not conduct a Q&A. Like one criticism I get for The Scene and the Unseen is, hey, you never disagree with anyone, which is blatantly untrue. I've disagreed with every guest I've ever had. Only it is so civil and so polite that people used to social media discourse don't even realize that we're actually arguing, right? So whatever the tone is, you establish it at the start. When I have the kind of personal conversations that I do, where I ask them about their childhood, about their parents, about whatever, I begin it in that tone. I am also vulnerable with them. I am also talking about myself. It's a conversation, not a Q&A. And I'm being authentic to myself, and they pick up on that, and then that becomes a groove that we enter. And similarly, maybe you're not doing a long conversation like me. Maybe it's a 15-minute conversation. You just want 10 crisp questions, crisp answers, and you let them know that that's what you're looking for, and then you begin with that. Then you cannot have a rambling question. Then you got to keep it crisp. So it sort of depends. Do your research. You need to have a minimum baseline of knowledge about the subject or guest to be able to have a relaxed conversation, right? This of course depends on the form. If you're doing a 5-minute Q&A, you can get away with not knowing much, but the longer you go, the more you need to kind of go. So if like when I research a guest, I read every book they've ever written, every interview they've ever given. I'll watch it or listen to it or whatever. If I know someone who knows them, I might speak to them about them as well. And I will also read a lot of other books on the subject if I feel I need to. So when I did my Gandhi episodes with Ram Guha, I not only read his books on Gandhi, but about 30 others. You need to kind of do this, because you will not be covering 90% of the stuff that you read, but it gives you that broad baseline. And then your guest feels that, this guy also knows the subject, and we can talk in that manner. So you got to do the prep. Respect your guest. My golden rule is I never interrupt. Do not interrupt. Do not look for gotcha moments like many interviewers will do. लेकिन आपने 1944 में ये कहा था, आज आप ये कह रहे हो. Don't get into shit like that. Unless that's a specific brief of a show like BBC's Hard Talk or whatever, where you're being adversarial or whatever. But in general, I would say that it's a terrible idea. Don't interrupt. The problem with interrupting is that at least what I try to do is get people to sink into themselves and be completely comfortable. And every time you interrupt, you bring them back to a more surface, shallow level. I've done an episode with Mrinal Pandey. If you listen to that, I ask my first question and then she talks for 1 hour, 5 minutes, and I don't interrupt, you know. And anybody else would have interrupted after 2 minutes and, अरे तो फिर उसके बारे में बताइए. But I just let her go, and it was magic. The kind of memory she came up with, where she basically went from the 50s to the end of the 70s. And it was magic. And you need to let that magic happen. And you need to then have the discipline to just sit and listen. Stephen Covey once said, most of us don't listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to reply. So there is ego there. And that ego is natural. All of us suffer from the main character syndrome. We are the main character in our lives. Everyone else is a prop or a side character. But it's incredibly rewarding when you leave that aside, when you just sit, when you immerse yourself into what a person is saying, give them that respect, just listen to them. So super important and hard to do when we're young. I wasn't a good listener when I was young, but in fact, the shows probably helped me become a better listener in real life as well. And this is one way in which the form can shape the content and can shape character, that you become a different person because you do that. M. Scott Peck very correctly said, true listening requires a setting aside of oneself. Like if you look at most conversations around us, it's all ego, 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 right? You're only listening because you're thinking, I'm going to interrupt with this, or no, I feel this. And sometimes it's nice to just sit back and take it in. Everybody's special. Tip 6, follow the flow. Don't premeditate the direction of the conversation. Too often what happens is that we'll have a list of questions, and when the person is answering question number 2, we'll already be thinking of the transition to question number 3. But maybe they say something interesting in that answer and it takes you into a different direction. And sometimes maybe you want to go there. So you want to be open to that. And of course, if you're doing like a 15-minute conversation, you may not have the luxury to be able to do this one. But if you if for a longer show like mine, obviously I have that luxury that I can meander and go around. And I'll always have a list of themes that these are the things I definitely want to cover. But apart from that, I'm happy to go into whatever directions we go in. And so stay in the moment, listen to what that person is saying. Don't just think, okay, ye mera agla question hai, and I have this witty sort of segue to it. Beware the curse of knowledge. Your listener does not know what you know. You might do really deep research and you might know a heck of a lot, but sometimes for the sake of the podcast, you have to realize that, especially if the guest sometimes goes into jargon or talks in a complicated way, which actually never happens with me, because I start by talking about their personal lives and then they're talking in normal language and they just continue throughout. But if that ever happens, you got to keep your listener in mind that they may not know everything that you know about a subject. So you could be discussing the 1962 war with China, and there's certain things that you know who was a foreign minister and all that, but your listener may not know. So sometimes you need to give that background and take that into account and not make it completely inaccessible. So shape the conversation accordingly. Now, quick tips on recording and editing. So I can kind of wrap this section up in 5 minutes and then we'll go to the Q&A. You can start with nothing. You can record directly into your cell phone or laptop. Free apps like Anchor and Audacity can take care of your tech needs. You can host on Anchor for free. You can even edit a little bit on Anchor. I think I don't use Anchor. And Audacity also, or GarageBand for Mac. They're all free apps. They're fantastic. You can, just start with them. For mics, start with a USB microphone for ease of use, because you can connect it to your laptop. You don't then need an audio interface. You just connect a USB microphone to your laptop and you're sort of ready to go. Now, there are two kinds of mics, dynamic and condenser. The basic funda very quickly is a condenser mic is incredibly sensitive. So it'll pick up every nuance of your voice. It's beautiful, but it'll also pick up every nuance of the surrounding sound. And therefore, condenser mic should only be used in studios where the sound is completely controlled. Dynamic mics are like what I'm using right now, which will cut out, which you have to hold close to you, because that's the only way they'll pick up the sound. And the good part is it'll cut out everything. So there's a dog barking outside, or there's someone doing something in the next room, those noises won't come. So when you see musicians, singers performing at concerts, they're holding a dynamic mic, so it doesn't pick up the sound of the crowd. And I would recommend you go with a dynamic mic, because you probably won't be recording in a studio. You'll be recording all over the place, ideally at least in your room, but otherwise all over the place where you can't control the sound. So a dynamic mic helps in that regard. A cardioid dynamic mic is the best option for budget users. Cardioid just means that it picks up what's in front of it and nothing else. So you have to hold it in front, but otherwise it's picking everything up. My mic recommendations, you can take a screenshot if you want. I won't linger here quickly. Cardioid dynamic mics, the one I recommend is the Audio-Technica ATR 2100X. That's the one I'm sort of using right now to speak. That's about 7,000. I have 3 of these set up, and the good part about them is they both have USB option, and that that other thing, my God, I've forgotten the word. I've blanked out. How can I do this? I'm a podcaster. But that other thing that goes into your audio interface, which in my case is the Zoom H6. So if you can afford it, the Shure SM7B is what people like Joe Rogan use, but that's way more expensive. And as you can hear, the sound of this is fine. And condenser mics, the ones I recommend are the Blue Yeti and the Blue Snowball Ice. I use a Blue Yeti as my backup mic. So this is my primary mic, but if it fails, I also have a Yeti recording another track. I've never needed the backup, but I have it there just in case. Then along with your mic, get a pop filter or a foam cover. Mine costs $249. They're really cheap. A pop filter will be this round thing that you see in front of the mic. A foam cover will be just a foam cover for the mic. You should get a boom arm. I recommend the Rode PSA-1, but that's about 9,000. I use something for $400. It's really cheap. I have 3 of these, easy to set up, easy to untangle. So as you can see, it's really cheap. Like, my headphone recommendation, any headphone will do, but you need one, because you need to hear the sound as it is being recorded. Because sometimes guests will move their mouth away from the headphone, like from the microphone, like I just did over here, and the quality of the sound will change. So you need to be able to be on top of that all the time. The Audio-Technica ATH MS20X, this is around 4,000, really cheap, works really well. It's a good studio microphone. Tip 1 for recording and editing: do intelligent jugaad. Satisficing is fine. You won't always get the perfect circumstances. Just do what you got to do. Go with it. Tip 2, prepping is easier than fixing. So if you check out the soundscape of a room beforehand, you do your test, you realize ki haan, yahan se reverb aa raha hai, or we should close this door. That's much easier than say trying to fix it later in post-production, when those things can become a problem. So research all the choices that you make. Tip 3 for editing: begin with free choices. Audacity for Windows, GarageBand for Macs. Tip 4 for remote recording: go with a specialist service. Don't use Zoom, because Zoom will sort of the sound gets compressed as it goes through the internet. So I use Quadcast. I used to use Encaster, but they messed up. But I use Quadcast, and there is Riverside. And go. What those services do is they'll record the audio on the user's laptop or the computer, and then they'll upload it at the end of the recording. So the sound quality will be good. It won't be compressed through the internet like a Zoom will. Aim to have a backup at each end. So whenever I'm recording remotely, I'm also recording my own backup over here. And if my guest is savvy enough, I ask them also to do it, but it's not necessary because Squadcast and all are quite reliable. Hosting and distribution technology is really old. They use RSS feeds. I'll just kind of skip this because it's really this thing. But when choosing a host, consider the trade-off. Some of them will have storage limits. Some will have download limits. If so many people download, after that you're paying more. Cost will be a factor. I use a service called Libsyn, which is a fixed monthly fee for a certain amount of storage. And that's been the oldest, a big player in the game. Anchor is free completely. I would just say that start free, start with Anchor. I would say you can always shift later. So wherever you start your podcast, you can shift the feed, you can shift everything. So why not start free? Don't spend money. Podcasting, quick podcasting gyan right now. Respect the listener. Don't take your listeners for granted. Don't condescend to them as broadcasters do. So don't put on a broadcasty voice. Aap samjhe main kya bata raha hu. Instead, talk one-on-one. This is a friend you're talking to. Talk respectfully. Most of your listeners probably are experts in their own fields, and they know a hell of a lot as well, right? So they are listening to you because they're on the same journey as you. So kind of respect that, be straightforward. The way I'm kind of speaking now, this is how I would speak to friends as well, right? I'm not doing anything special. Be authentic to yourself. There are a million podcasts out there. Every genre has been covered. Ideas are a dime a dozen. So the only thing that makes your podcast stand out is you. So don't say ki, "Arey, I have to look for a niche to fill. Will people want to listen?" No, as long as you're you, as long as you're authentic, that's all that matters. Don't fall for the imposter syndrome, which especially women fall for much more than they should, much more than men, where you say, "Arey, who will want to listen to me? What's special about me?" Don't do that. All of us are on journeys. You are on a journey of a sort of figuring stuff out, a journey in life. And there will be so many people who will be on a similar journey before, at an earlier stage or a later stage, and they can relate to you. And that's the beauty of podcasting. It's that kind of intimate personal medium. So just make it about you. Don't hesitate to make it personal, to just be you. That's what makes you unique. Put that at the forefront, and it will work. And also travel not just across space where everybody different places listen to you, but travel across time. Don't make podcasts just for the present moment. If there's a piece of this world worth documenting or saving, then do it. Even if people don't listen to, like, what I keep telling myself is, I don't care if somebody doesn't listen today. At 2050 there will be this repository of content that they can listen to. Like, two of my most joyful episodes are the 8-hour episodes I did with Shanta Gokhale and Jerry Pinto, because they're like oral histories. I'm documenting a person, the life of a person, the times they lived through. That's invaluable. You can't put a price on that. I'm fortunate enough to have a very good listenership in this present time. But even if I didn't, I would still do it because it is worth doing. So just be driven by that and do it for that reason. Make it worthwhile for the listener of 2050. And finally, play the long game. Creators tend to underestimate the short term and overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term, right? Don't expect immediate payoffs. People will often start saying, "Arey, viral ho jayega, ye hoga, wo hoga." No, it takes a long, long time to build something, and therefore don't do it for immediate validation. Do it for do it for the love of it, and eventually it'll take off, hopefully in a way that you didn't expect. But if you just do it for immediate validation, it won't work, because right at the start, whenever you start something, you suck. My early episodes of the Seen and the Unseen aren't great, which is why I tell people to listen in reverse order. Right, initially you're just learning, and the only way to get better is by constant iteration, by doing something again and again and again. Now, if you're depending on immediate validation, you will not get that validation for your early episodes when you're not very good. Nobody is good at the start. So you just have to ignore the validation. If you love doing it, just keep doing it. Keep doing it. You'll eventually get better, and it'll feel really rewarding. It takes time and patience. I won't go through this graph now, but it's basically Ali Abdal talking about how he reached 1 million users. And he pointed out that he made 2 videos a week for half a year. And when he made his 50th video, he got his 1,000th subscriber. Now, 1,000 subscribers is a ridiculously low number. Most of us would just give up by that time. But he just went on, and eventually exponential growth. I think he's at over 2 million now. And his advice to creators, which I think is incredible advice, is do 2 videos a week for 2 years, right? That's 200 videos. And for that time, don't look at the numbers, right? Which means you have to love what you're doing, which means it has to be authentic to who you are. But don't look at the numbers, just go out there and do it. Warren Buffett once said, someone's sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. So plant that tree now. Don't expect the shade. Do it because you love it. Do it because it's worth doing. That's the advice that I would give. Quick podcasting gyan number 5. Don't tick boxes. Digital marketing is overrated. At the start, focus your time and energy on creating a great product. Like, I have this idealistic view that the product is the marketing, that a good product is the best marketing. And perhaps I'm idealistic, but and perhaps I'm rationalizing because I often don't have the time to market myself or do any of those things. But I just focus everything on creating what I'm creating. And I'd give you that same advice, that is what matters, So initially, don't worry about the stuff around it. The stuff around it does matter at a later stage. If you're creating good content, you want as many people to view it as possible, listen to it as possible. But, initially just focus on the content itself and understand the great trade-off, getting it right versus getting it done. A trade-off we face for everything. Now, getting it right is planning and prepping something till it works out just fine. So you'll begin with a clarity of purpose, and then you plan. Abraham Lincoln once said, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree. I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe, right? And a great quote. But my bias is towards getting it done. The brain is wired to procrastinate, right? Neil Simon once said, there are watchers in this world and there are doers, and the watchers sit around watching the doers do. Don't be a watcher. You can plan. Planning is a rationalization for laziness, frankly. And I'm berating myself and lamenting my own situation in other contexts as I sort of say this. But have a bias for action. Get it done. And honestly, the only way to get it right is actually to get it done again and again and again. So that's where your bias should be. Get it done. Start podcasting now. And I think Venkatesh must be tearing his hair out because 40 minute bola tha, 1 ghanta ho gaya. But I hope it was worth it, and I'll answer as many questions as you would like me to. So I'll stop sharing the screen now, and here we go. Venkatesh, we can't hear you. Can't hear you. I mean, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Can't hear you. Shall I try to imagine what you're saying? Or maybe I can ask ChatGPT, what is Venkatesh saying right now? And then I'll read that out.
Now, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. You got scared with that threat. Huh?
Sorry. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed, Amit, but I cannot really tear my hair out. So,
Right. Okay. Apologies. I hope I haven't brought you to this state.
No, not at all. And thank you so much. That was a brilliant hour that we spent. And I would imagine there would be a lot of questions. Remember, there is no such thing as a bad question or a basic question. Sometimes the most basic questions lead to the most interesting answers. So please start putting your questions in, and we'll try to answer as many, because Amit has kind of promised that he's going to stick around till he answers everything. So let's get started. And okay, so let's
say hello to my pig.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing I really enjoy about have learned from Amit is to mix in seriousness and irreverence. So I guess the pig was the serious part and everything else was irreverent. That itself is a terrible one. Okay, so Irfan Mehraj asks a question, and I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of a newsroom, right? What are the key elements of a news podcasts? I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amit, that the pressures that come with the newsroom is, let's do it quickly, let's do it, and then let's spend as little time as possible, and let's do as many podcasts as possible, and let's grow our listenership that way. But I guess that's really the wrong answer, wrong question to ask, isn't it? I don't know. What would you say to that?
No, I think, like you said, there's no wrong question as such. And one, I don't really have expertise for to talk about newsrooms per se, but the thoughts that come to me is that number one, when and again, to kind of sum up, which I probably should have done at the end, that the reason podcasting therefore is so good at fighting disinformation and building a skeptical mindset is that it allows people to go deep, and they automatically then bring building that mindset and all of that. And I think one of the things that we should keep in mind while we are in the daily hubbub of creating whatever podcasts or news that we do to fight this information is that don't make it seem like a narrative battle. Don't make it seem like इन्होंने ये कहा, actually सच ये है. But try to take a more nuanced approach and try to throw something in there that provokes the listener or the viewer to think about it for themselves. Because what you always want to do is, it is not a question of one side presents one fact, another side presents one fact, then basically everyone is preaching to the converted, right? But what you want to do is, you want to over time build a skeptical mindset so the reader can sort of check it out for themselves, which is why, when I do my podcast, I'll have enormous show notes, so those rabbit holes are there for listeners to go into themselves. And so I would say that that's one thing. Be a little careful of getting into those sort of narrative battles from one side or the other. And what I would also say is that uh, it's okay sometimes to have those daily kind of podcasts. Maybe you're doing a 5-minute wrap every day of what happened that day and so on and so forth, and that's perfectly fine. But also try, as a news organization, to perhaps have a weekly podcast where a couple of people can sit and talk to each other about the news of the week, and it's more considered, and there's more therav, and there's more gravitas, and you can get deeper and more nuanced and more complex and whatever. And try to sort of do that, because then what that does is that when you are in conversation with yourselves, the reader is also in conversation with you. That's the beauty of podcasting. It's a voice in your head. And you build better listeners that way. Otherwise, you go from sort of sensation to sensation. I mean, I don't know if that's helpful, because I haven't actually worked in that kind of a newsroom, but thinking aloud, this is what comes to me.
That's fantastic. Nandita Kalidas says, always great to listen to you, Amit. We've done an in-house podcast series on health misinformation in 2021 across sectors. We had experts talking on COVID-19, cancer, and tobacco. So she's got two questions. The first is, how do you reach your relevant audience? Especially with debunking misinformation, we get people from both sides who are both in awe and skeptical of our work. So that's the first question, and I'll ask the second question.
Yeah. So the first question is that it is really tough, because there's no discovery medium per se. None of the podcasting apps are really good discovery mediums per se. So it's really hard. A lot of it is organic and word of mouth. Most digital marketing is really what one of the guests on my show, the advertising professional Ambi Parmeswaran, called spray and pray, right? So it's hard. I don't have a good answer for this. I think I got really lucky at the stage that I did, but it took a long time to build up to where it was, and it was really gradual. I produce another podcast called Brave New World at bravenewpodcast.com for a friend of mine called Vasandhar, who is an AI professor in New York, and he's spoken to awesome guests like Daniel Kahneman and Jonathan Haidt and Scott Galloway and a whole bunch of people. Great conversations. It's just never taken off. It has just never taken off. And I've noticed that most new podcasts are always sort of at this really low baseline of even a few hundred listeners, right? And I don't know what to do about this. I know of podcasts who've spent money, who've tried digital marketing, who've tried this and that. I don't know what to do about this. But what I would, and I'm not a marketing expert or a virality expert, what I would say from my admittedly sort of privileged location, as someone who by good fortune has sort of got an audience, is that the important thing is just keep doing it if you feel it's worth doing. Like I bet that when you started it, your initial thing was that this needs to be done. No one is doing it. There's so much health misinformation out there. We will do it, right? That's a perfect reason to start, and a perfect reason to just kind of do it, and then it finds its own audience over time. It is much harder for a podcast like yours, to be honest, because you find an audience over time with regularity. You become part of someone's routine. So people listen to you every Monday, that kind of thing. And for a limited series podcast, if you're doing like 10 episodes on a particular thing, it's much harder. So you need to at some level motivate yourself by saying that we are just creating this repository. It will be there forever. It is worth doing. We are doing it. And beyond that, I am of course not an expert in marketing at all, but I also don't know anyone who's really cracked this. How do you make, and all successes in the creator economies are really, when you dig deep down, they're organic successes. They happen over time. There's no secret sauce that way. So I don't want to wing it and give you a checklist of things to do, ki insta mein ye karo, usme wo karo,
Yeah. I want to add something to it. I also apologize. There's a lot of music in the background that I'm not able to control. Carnatic music. So hopefully it's not too unpleasant. So, the Swaddle has on its Instagram feed has got a bunch of videos which are actually focused on their podcast. So it's I can't show it to you, but I look at this. This is something someone from Business Line did as an experiment. Mohammed Ryan, if he's there, that's a shout out for him.
If you cover your face, it will focus. Right now, the focus is still on your face. Cover your face with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah.
This, so what happens is, this is a software called it's called Descript, and what the Swaddle does very interestingly is they put these up as Instagram posts. They're basically splinters and chunks of their podcast, but I don't think these things will bring the listener to the podcast. It's just that the listener is going to look at it on Instagram and going to spend the 30 seconds listening to that chunk, and they will know that you have a podcast, but I don't think they're actually going to come there.
Right? So these are called audiograms. I tried them ages back, where I would use them and put them on Twitter and see what happened, and they had literally zero impact. It was like a waste of time for me. So zero observable impact. So it depends on the resources that you have. So if you're a large organization, you have one bunch of people who do the podcast, and then you have people helping out who can create these little audiograms or these little nuggets or excerpts or whatever. That's great. Why not do it? There's no harm in doing it. But in my own case, I decided at one point, after flirting with different ways to present my content, that I'm just going to 100% focus on the episodes that I do and the actual work itself, and not on this, because to me, the payback, there was no payback. It wasn't worth the time. But if you have more resources, it's worth experimenting with. The whole thing is throw different things at the wall. But the other piece of advice I would really give here, and perhaps I'm being idealistic, but my view of this is that whatever you do on any other medium, or whatever other form you experiment with, don't look at it as a cynical marketing exercise. Look at it as a piece of content in its own right, something that can stand by itself. So if you are using Descript to take an Instagram quote from your podcast, your purpose shouldn't be कि podcast को market करना है, कुछ भी निकाल के डाल दो and whatever. Your purpose should be as a standalone piece of content. Is it compelling? Is it worth it? Can it? Because then maybe it could go viral on its own, and maybe you have something else that kind of takes off from that. So that is always the way that I think about it, that don't think of anything as marketing, because everything is your brand. Ultimately. So whatever you do, if you decide we'll use Instagram for marketing, don't think of it as for marketing. Think of it as another content outlet where maybe you repurpose your current content in a way that works for that medium. But, it should not be a force fit for the sake of marketing and you're ticking boxes ki ye karna chahiye, wo karna chahiye. That's how I would approach it.
As you also said, the product is the best marketing. So there's a second question she asks: how do you convey data on a podcast format? Given that you earlier said, we are not wired to listen to big numbers. So they say they often try to humanize and contextualize the data, but it still remains to be a challenge.
Yeah, she's absolutely right. You have to humanize and contextualize it, and it is a big challenge. Typically the way to do it is to kind of make it relatable for the listener in a way that they can understand. For example, during the pandemic, if you want to talk about how many masks were manufactured in a day in Maharashtra. You could say that if you laid them all out end to end, you could, it would go from Mumbai to Kolhapur or whatever, something relatable. Or if you stack up all the sanitizer bottles or all the syringes used to vaccinate people, you would go from the earth to the moon. I mean, I'm not saying you actually would. You have to do the math and figure out something that works. But you have to figure out something relatable, because obviously our brains have evolved in prehistoric times and we cannot compute large numbers. So there's actually no practical difference between 10 million and 100 million in the minds of people after a certain point in time, even though obviously there's a massive difference. So it's important to do that. And it's also important to humanize it when you can. For example, just taking a pandemic example, if you're talking about the terrible tragedy of the forced migration of laborers across the country that happened in the early days of the first lockdown, one thing is you can give the numbers and you can say that, so many people had to walk so many miles or whatever. But the other thing is you can tell a story. Like there was this photograph, or maybe it was a video by Barkha, or I don't remember what it was, but it was a visual. And it was this woman pulling a suitcase on wheels along a highway from Delhi to somewhere with her ill husband or child, I forget who, on that suitcase which she's pulling with wheels, because that person is too weak to and that's literally, forgive me for the cliche, but that's literally a picture painting 1,000 words. That is show don't tell. So you do have to figure that out. But the point is that can sometimes become a cynical exercise. Like I did an episode with the great journalist Rukmini S, and Rukmini pointed out that it's almost become a cliche for journalists now when they are dealing with data to begin with a human story, right? And then they go on to the data. And the danger there is that that can be overly simplistic, because you will always cherry pick a particular human story for a particular piece of data you want to highlight. So even that doesn't tell the full story. But while it may have become a cliche of sorts and a convention of sorts, it's still useful. I don't see a way around it. You have to figure out ways to use the data in a way that somebody can relate to it. And it is a challenge, but as far as possible, you got to do that.
There was a related question from Parvati Mohan, which I think we've already answered. I'm just going to read it out. What are your thoughts on marketing podcasts? This is something we at Factly, she says, are wondering how to crack. Since our content is all about data journalism and fact checking, there seem to be a few takers. I'm just taking that as having you having already answered, Amit. At some point, if there's something else that strikes you, please chime in. But
I mean, what I would say there is that it's a dual thing and it's a contradictory thing. So I am large, I contain multitudes, I'll contradict myself. And and the first thing I would say is that at one level, the very term marketing means that you are concerned about what people want. And the danger there is that you keep second guessing yourself, and that affects your content and the integrity of your content and the authenticity of your content. So that is something to watch out for. But on the other hand, if you're creating great content, you have a responsibility to that content, especially if it is an important subject, to make it reach as many people as possible. And the way to do that is not by tweaking the content itself, but the form. The questions to then ask is, can I do an A/B test on the kind of form that I'm putting this content out in? So you don't actually compromise on the content itself per se, but you think about, like, am I, to go back to the earlier question, are there too many numbers in this which are hard to understand? Can I tell a story? Can I humanize it? Can I do it another way? In the context of a YouTube video, it could be, the sort of captions you use or whatever. So you can tinker around with the form, but never compromise with the content, because if you do that, then what are you even doing? Why are you doing it?
Excellent. Brijesh Karta asks, how does copyright work for a podcast? Should podcasters explicitly note their rights on the material, or is this implicit?
Okay, I don't know the legal answer. I think it's kind of implicit, but I think most podcasters take the attitude towards it that I do, which is that, you want to do something, you want to excerpt something and use it. Yeah, fine, go ahead. That's the approach that we take. Like our approach towards copyright, for the material that we use in our podcast, my approach is that, when I'm quoting someone, I'll say who I'm quoting and so on and so forth, side books, my show notes, as everything. But like, of course, I have the copyright of my podcast, but it's really never been an issue, at least for me, because back in the blogging days, I'd put up a great post and somebody would immediately plagiarize it, and you had to deal with all the, I forget what the terms are now, but you had to, there were ways of complaining to their hosts and all of that. But in podcasting, there's really nothing like that, and I think all podcasts like mine are just part of this giant ongoing conversation. So you want engagement, you want all of that. So I've never really had to think about it, to be honest.
Okay. Simon Verghese asked, who was that chap, Ali? I guess you're referring to Ali Abdal.
Ali Abdal, yeah. Yeah, that's Ali Abdal, AliAbdaal. If you search for him on YouTube, great channel. Built it up in 5 years. He's got two particular videos that that I think have useful advice for creators. If you go to my website, seenunseen.in, and you search for Ali, I would have linked both of those videos in some show notes somewhere or the other, maybe multiple times. So you can actually go to the specific videos from there. Just go to seenunseen.in and search for his name. And the Abdal is with a double A at the end. So Abdaal. So if you just search for that, you'll find it in my show notes somewhere, those two specific videos. But a very consummate creator who has exactly the approach that I like towards creating, which is like, one, get it done, bias for action. I don't necessarily act upon it myself when it comes to video, but and the other is that don't think about validation. Just keep going. Just do it for because it's worth doing.
Okay. There are two questions. Someone called Kamran Ashraf has sent a link as well. So there are a couple of questions which I'm going to batch together. Rusbe Legatis, I'm sorry if I have not pronounced your name right, asks, in my question, I think about podcasts tackling controversial topics and political issues. A skeptical mentality in these contexts sounds important, but I was wondering what that means in practice. I think there's someone else who asked about skeptical mentality. So could you talk a little bit more about what that means in practice?
So I'll talk about skeptical mentality in the context of, let's say, a great compliment I was given recently when Shreyana Bhattacharya, with whom I did an episode on her book, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh. The episode was called The Loneliness of the Indian Woman. It's my most downloaded episode with her. She told me recently that I was an anti-uncle. So we were at an event where she said this, and I asked her, like, what is an anti-uncle? So she said that despite my not liking Shah Rukh Khan, I still read the book and engaged with the content, and that is an anti-uncle mentality, because an uncle has made up his mind about everything and is not going to change. And I think that also speaks to the skeptical mindset. You could also call it an open mindset, where the idea is that you're always open to engaging. Too often what has happened in modern times is that because of the tone of our discourse set by social media, if you disagree with someone, they are evil, they're just bad people, right? And most people are not bad people, and some of our ideas aren't necessarily entirely right as well. We always have to be open to discussing stuff, to being challenged. My recent episode with Nitin Pai had a furious discussion on Kashmir, for example, where both of us vehemently made our points. My point being that, I think our occupation of Kashmir has been more brutal than the British occupation of India was. And his point was a nationalistic thing, that integral part of our territory. But the important thing is, none of us condemn the other person as evil or anti-national or anything. That we could have that discussion and remain friendly, and it was mutually respectful, and yet we both made our points very forcefully, because we feel strongly about them. To me, that's a skeptical open mindset, and the way you build that is your content will draw the kind of listener who appreciates it. So if your content has that openness and that skepticism, then the reader will appreciate that. That does not mean, by the way, that that you're monkey balancing all the time. There's this old quote about how if one guy says that it's raining outside and the other guy says it's not raining outside, the journalist's job is to go open the window and report the truth, right? So it isn't that you always have to kind of present every side of the argument, but most of the time the truth is not as clear as, is it raining outside or not. One guy could be in Delhi, one guy could be in Bombay, for example. So the truth is nuanced and difficult. So so if you take that approach to your podcast, where you're always civil, you're engaging in good faith, then I think that it'll attract that kind of listener, or in the listeners that you do have, it'll activate those parts of their brain which are, you know, where they're more willing to be patient and sit back and listen. And that's an important mindset, because to think of countering fake news with fact checking is to imagine that people are sheep, that किसी ने fake news दिया, किसी ने fact checking दिया, it becomes a battle. But people aren't sheep. People are people. They're thinking for themselves. They have their own preferences. They have their own incentives. Many of those incentives drive them towards narrative battles and picking ideological tribes and all of that. But they also want to understand the world, figure it out, be rational. And you have to play to those. You have to play to those and sort of tweak those buttons of, those particular buttons as it.
Excellent. Okay, so a statement and a question. The statement is from Champika Damayanti. Mr. Amit, you're my most favorite journalist. Happy to listen to you hear about many, many important things. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
So that is, and then the question is, how, from Pooja Bhula, how do you make it financially sustainable? How do you make it financially?
Yeah, so I've kind of been fortunate in that, like advertisers come to me sometimes, but I spend zero time on sales. So jo samne se aata hai, that's fine. People do that sometimes, where a listener will say that, hey, let me sponsor something. But a lot of my slots are just empty, and that doesn't make me that much. I also have this thing on the site which I started during COVID, where I said I'm never going to take it behind a paywall because I want everyone to listen. But if you want to support the show, you can do that. And I give a link for that right at the end of my podcast and on my site, but I don't really advertise it or talk about it. But that brings in enough, thanks to the generosity of people, that the show can be independent. And plus, I think as a creator, you need to think in terms of 2 Rs, which are reach and revenue, right? You do some things for reach, you do some things for revenue. And the podcast got me reach and a certain credibility. And then I used that to run this writing course, of which I finished completing 26 cohorts. I've had 2,000 people more than 2,000 people have done my Art of Clear Writing course. So that became my revenue source. But at the same time, like I said earlier, you can't think of anything in terms of just cynically using it for marketing or revenue. That has to be a good product by itself. And today, many of the people who sign up haven't even heard of the podcast or heard of me. They just come because, other people who've done the course have said, hey, you should do it. So it's like a product on its own. So so that is sort of how I make my money. I've been very lucky. I've been fortunate. In India, I am certainly an outlier. But across the world, creators more and more are making a lot more money. Like if we had the time, I could do a presentation on the creator economy also, that I prepared a while back, about how everything has changed. But one way in which everything has changed is that back in the day, we could not reach our audiences directly or monetize the value they placed on us. Today, there are more and more ways to do that. So I'd say, as a creator, think of yourself as the entrepreneur of your own brand, as it were, and think about all the different things you want to do. Don't put yourself in a box saying कि मुझे सिर्फ TV करना है, या audio करना है, या writing करना है. You're a creator. You can create in any medium. There's an initial learning curve, but then you can kind of get there. So don't restrict yourself to a box. And what the modern technology allows you to do is also to build an audience of your own. Like in the 90s, if I was a creator, I can't actually build a community of my fans per se. You might see a piece by me in Indian Express today, and you say, huh, good writer, nice guy. But then you forget. And then 2 months later, Times of India, and you're like, okay, huh, name sounds familiar. But today you can read a Substack post by me and subscribe. You can listen to an episode by me and subscribe. And then everything I do is going to your inbox or your podcast player or whatever. And I have this captive community of people who appreciate my work, who are engaging with it, and who are willing to share some of that value with me. Because everyone who consumes your work, see, this is a great sort of friction of our times, right? Every single person who consumes your work is paying for it, because time is money, right? But they have no way of getting a little bit of that value across to you, that they would love to do it if they could. So how do we get past that? And the mechanisms of the past are now outdated. So if you're a writer, You'd publish in the Times of India in 95. They would accumulate eyeballs. They would get advertisers for those eyeballs, and you would get a tiny, tiny chunk of what came in. Today, there are better ways to monetize where people can subscribe to you. People can buy you a coffee, as it were. They can do all of that. But I think that there are great opportunities for entrepreneurs who are thinking out of the box for even further ways to make that to reduce that friction and make that transfer of value as seamless as possible. Because every time I read something I like or listen to something I like, I feel that surge of gratitude, but there's too much friction in going online and figuring out how to express myself in that way. um, so I think that's kind of changing with time, and I've rambled a lot. So did I answer the question? I hope I did.
I think you did, and I think what I appreciate about you is you give us honest answers. You don't try to answer something you don't know, which is what we see a lot of. So I appreciate that. Shanawaz Akhtar asks, "What is the ideal duration of a podcast, and what should a beginner focus more on, stories or interviews?" Now, before you answer that, Amit, I have a trivia question. There's a guy who um, did a 12-minute podcast episode, and the same guy also did an 8-hour podcast episode. Can you guess who I'm talking about?
You said 8 hours, so everybody knows. It's obviously me. One of my early episodes was 11 minutes with Mohit Satyanand. It's called It's All Because of Rupal Ben, which is a nice episode. And I'll use that as sort of a crux for my answer for Shanawaz's excellent and pertinent question, which is that the duration really depends on what you want to do. There's no good duration per se, right? In the sense that I wanted to dive deep, and, I initially started by The Seen and the Unseen is named after a 19th century essay by Frederick Bastiat, That Which is Seen and That Which is Not Seen. So initially I thought, okay, it's going to be about the unforeseen consequences of public policy. Then it gradually became a deep dive into subjects, and that took the length to 1 hour and then to 2 hours. Then it gradually became a deep dive into people, which is why it can often be 5, 6, 7 hours now. So there's no value judgment there. You have to figure out what you want to do, right? What you want to do, what you have the bandwidth and the capacity to do, how much time your guests will give you also becomes a question. Like with Indian guests, I have no issues to them committing 5 open-ended hours for me. But foreign guests are like, what? Because I've never heard of the show, right? So you ask them for 5 hours and they're like, what? Who are you? Sam Harris asked me for 1 hour. Tum kaun ho? I mean, not in these words, but you know the vibe. So all those sort of factors come into play. But I would say that there is no correct length. Sometimes just doing a 10-minute recap of what happened that day or giving your 10-minute take on an issue every day could be really valuable. But if you consider the audio medium, I would say that for shorter podcasts, it's harder to take off because podcasts take off and they become a habit. Regular listeners are listening at double speed and so on. If you do a 10-minute podcast, somebody is going out to go jogging, they're listening at double speed. By the time they've tied their shoelaces, it's over, right? So that is a barrier for shorter podcasts. Whereas longer podcasts, you can become somebody's habit and it's a little more meaty, but it depends on you. And the same thing about whether you should do a story or an interview. The question is only you can answer that, because there's no right or wrong. There's no implicit value on story versus interview or duration wise. It depends on what do you want to do. And I would say don't second guess ki log kya sunenge, what will take off, what does the audience want, where is niche. Ignore all of that. Just go in doing the kind of stuff you'd like to do. Experiment. Initially no one will listen to you, and that's probably, unless you get like incredibly outlier type lucky or you're Shah Rukh Khan or something. But initially no one will listen to you, and that's great, because then that gives you the freedom to experiment without stress, to find your voice. But always just do it because you love doing it, because you're happy with what's coming out of it, or at least you're happy with the learning process and you're learning about stuff. So uh, yeah, I mean, all these forms have their pros and cons, and if you just think about them, they'll sort of be obvious to you, and you follow your inclinations.
Great. Now I'm batching 2 questions. Pooja Bhula asks, what kind of time do you end up spending on one podcast? And question from Ramnath Subbaraman is, do you spend time talking to your guests before the recording of the podcast? How long do they go? What do you discuss before that is? How important is that for your preparation?
Yeah, my preparation time can depend, and it will be shorter for me than others doing the same kind of prep, because the one fortunate superpower I'm blessed with is I can read fast and deep at the same time. But this is compensated by a lack of memory. So a lot of my research I'll actually deliberately do at close to the last minute, but I can read 3, 4 books thoroughly in a day. So luckily I have that. Uh, so it really depends on what the subject is and how deep I need to go. The minimum that I will do is I will read everything the author's ever written that is available, all their books, whatever they've written. I will listen to every YouTube interview or podcast interview they've ever given, taking notes all the while. I use something called Rome Research to take notes. So that is a minimum sort of effort that I make. It can accumulate to 30, 40, 50, 60 hours, or it can accumulate to 5, 6 hours where the guest may not have written a book, but they've had an interesting life. And note that I read fast and deep at the same time, and whatever stuff I consume, whether it's video or audio, it's always at double speed or more. So I'm taking in this stuff really fast. um, so it depends on the guest. Like when I went to Delhi in August, I last year I recorded 12 episodes in 12 days. So, and getting practically no sleep, it was not a good idea. Um, and I'm going to Delhi again next week, but little easier, 9 episodes in 12 days. But so it's not that I'm spending 30, 40 hours for every episode, but then it depends. I'll strategize that, the ones that are in the middle are probably ones where the person hasn't written a book, interesting life. I have kind of perhaps enough craft and knowledge to be able to go into that and manage that, and make sure that the people for whom there is 30, 40 hours of reading, that I actually do have that time, and I'll do some of it before the trip, in fact. And to answer Ramnath's question, it's not actually necessary, and the guests often won't have the time. So it might help, but very often some of my finest conversations have been with people I've literally met for the first time. And obviously I've done my research, I've done my homework, I know everything, but it's literally I'm speaking to them for the first time. Before that, we've just emailed, and I've invited them and they've said yes, and we go from there. Like I think my episode 299 was with Samarth Bansal, and we were meeting for the second time but not really had a conversation, and I loved that episode. And um, Nikhil Taneja, The Loneliness of the Indian Man, companion to Shrana's episode. That was 7.5 hours. We were meeting for the first time, recorded all day at home, and no prior conversation. So I don't think a prior conversation is necessary. I don't think it harms, but for logistical reasons, I've never really gotten into that habit, and I don't think it's necessary. It may help. It depends on what your style of podcasting is, or what are the areas you want to explore, and so on and so forth. Depends from guest to guest also as well. But most of my episodes are just cold. Like I'll do a mountain of research and then I'll get into it, and then we just talk. And luckily my most of my guests who come on the show have heard the show. They understand the relaxed discursive vibe. So I'm fortunate that they'll just trust me and open up and speak in good faith. And so establishing the vibe hasn't really been hard for me in the last 3, 4 years, because people know the show.
Great. It's around the 90-minute mark. In fact, it's the 90-minute mark if we count that we started 3 minutes late. And Amit has been exceedingly generous, and he's willing to answer a few more questions. So I'm going to go with, there are some questions, Amit, on equipment and all of that. I'll come to that, but there is a question in Hindi which I want to get to. Can you answer in Hindi, please? So
Yeah,
Ashok
of
Kumar,
course.
मैंने अभी तक पॉडकास्ट शुरू नहीं किया, लेकिन अमित जी के को सुनकर अब जरूर करूंगा. क्या कोई ऐसा वीडियो या लिंक मिल सकता है जिससे मैं बेसिक्स और शुरुआती बातें समझ सकूं?
अगर आप YouTube पे ढूंढेंगे कि हाउ टू स्टार्ट पॉडकास्टिंग एंड ऑल दैट, वीडियो तो काफ़ी मिल जाएंगे. लेकिन वो अलग अलग चीज़ें बोलेंगे, तो चांस है कि कंफ्यूजन भी हो सकता है. जब मैं शुरू कर रहा था, डेफिनेटली कंफ्यूजन था कि कौन सा माइक यूज़ करना है, ये करना है, वो करना है. सो वो कंफ्यूजन तो हो सकता है. बट अगर आप वेंकटेश को अपना ईमेल दे देंगे, तो जिनको भी ये ईमेल देंगे उनको मैं भेज सकता हूँ एक डॉक्यूमेंट जिसमें एटलीस्ट इक्विपमेंट की लिस्ट है, तो वहां से आप देख सकते हैं. लेकिन मेरा सुझाव यही होगा कि आप मतलब कि आप फोन से भी शुरू कर सकते हैं, आप आज ही शुरू कर सकते हैं, बिकॉज शुरू में तो आप ट्रायल करेंगे ना, ये नहीं कि आप पहले ही कूद जाएंगे और कुछ करेंगे। तो ये स्टोरी टेलिंग भी हो तो आप ट्रायल करेंगे, इंटरव्यू है तो मेरा सुझाव रहेगा कि अगर आप इंटरव्यू शो कर रहे हैं तो पहला शो किसी दोस्त के साथ ही कीजिए, या किसी को आप जानते हैं, तो अगर वो यूज ना करे, अगर आपके लिए वो लर्निंग प्रोसेस है, तो वो समझेंगे, दे वोंट होल्ड इट अगेंस्ट यू। तो मुझे लगता है कि वही कीजिए। मेरे कुछ एपिसोड्स हिंदी में भी हुए हैं, एपिसोड 86 गुणवंत पाटिल साहब के साथ, तो वो आप सुन सकते हैं। वो शायद 1-1.5 घंटे का एपिसोड है। मृणाल पांडे जी के साथ मेरा बहुत अच्छा एपिसोड है, बहुत अच्छा बोलती है। हुसैन हैदरी और वरुण ग्रोवर ने भी मेरे साथ एपिसोड किए है, जिसमें उन्होंने हिंदी में बोला है। लेकिन क्या होता है कि अगर आपके कुछ इश्यूज पे कंफ्यूजन है, तो लोग क्या करते हैं कि उस कंफ्यूजन के कारण वो रुक जाते हैं, वो करते ही नहीं है। तो आप वैसा मत होने दीजिए आपके साथ कि आप जब भी कुछ शुरू करेंगे, सब कुछ तो आपको पता नहीं होगा। तो लेकिन आप शुरू कीजिए, आप शुरू कीजिए, आप उसको हैबिट बनाइए, फिर आप करते करते सीखते जाएंगे। तो ऑलवेज वही बेस्ट है। कोई सिंगल रिसोर्स तो वैसे नहीं है। मतलब मैं जब देख रहा था, लाइक मेरा जो सीखने का तरीका था वो था कि दूसरों पॉडकास्टर्स को सुनिए कि वो क्या करते हैं, वो कैसे सवाल पूछते हैं, वो कैसे करते हैं। और ज्यादातर क्या हुआ कि जैसे मेरा शो लंबा होता गया, तो मेरे लिए कोई गाइड्स नहीं थे। लाइक 8 घंटे के एपिसोड के लिए मतलब आप क्या मतलब वैसे कोई है ही नहीं पॉडकास्टर्स, तो आपको खुद बनाने पड़ते हैं कि रूल्स क्या है, फर्स्ट प्रिंसिपल्स क्या है। तो आजकल मैं जब लॉन्ग फॉर्म पॉडकास्ट में जाता हूँ, मेरे पास मतलब कि यू नो आई टॉक अबाउट कि 3 अलग तरह के स्कैफोल्डिंग्स होते हैं। स्कैफोल्डिंग मतलब जो बिल्डिंग को होल्ड अप करता है, कि एक स्कैफोल्डिंग है द पर्सनल लाइफ ऑफ द गेस्ट, कि उनकी जो क्रोनोलॉजी क्या है, उनके लाइफ में क्या हुआ है। और एक स्कैफोल्डिंग है उनका जो काम है, उन्होंने जो भी विषय पे किताबें लिखी है। और तीसरा स्कैफोल्डिंग है वो आइडियाज जो मैं उनके साथ डिस्कस करना चाहता हूँ। तो ये 3 स्कैफोल्डिंग बन जाते हैं, और फिर मेरा काम बनता है कि इन तीनों को फिर बैलेंस करे, यहाँ से वहां जाए, वहां से यहाँ जाए। लेकिन ये सब मुझे खुद सीखना पड़ा। ये आपको बाहर मतलब कुछ मिलेगा नहीं गाइड, क्योंकि इतनी लंबी पॉडकास्ट कोई करता नहीं है, पूरा फील्ड नया है। तो मैं बस कहता हूँ कि आप कूद जाइए, आप करते रहिए, और आप करते करते आप सीख लेंगे।
There is a Hindi saying which I'm going to mangle, but I really enjoyed it, which is "लिखते लिखते हाथ साफ हो जाता है." So when you continue doing it, you just get better, right? So
इट्स ब्यूटीफुल।
yeah. So
या या
right. Okay, so there's some interesting questions, Amit. One is, would you ever pivot to video? Your guests are often passionate speakers. I find myself visualizing how they would look while telling their stories. This is a question by Anuj Gurwara. I understand the challenges of editing, etc. Considering your long form episodes, is there any other reason you've remained with audio? And he also adds, I enjoy watching Joe Rogan's podcast as much as I enjoy listening to them.
Yeah, so Joe Rogan has a full production army and makes a lot of money, so it's easier for him. I think logistically it's a problem. Don't think I'll ever do the seen and the unseen on video, this particular show, because number one part of the reason it really works is that the guests really relax and they just like I've had, like, one of my guests told me later that his wife had a fight with him because she said, we've been married for 30 years, but you told Amit things you've never told me, because you take them to those places, to their childhood, to all of those interior spaces. And I'm not sure that would necessarily flow so well if there was a camera there. At various times guests have teared up on my show, I've teared up listening to them. I'm not sure that would happen if cameras were there, because there's an extra layer of consciousness. And also the long format works for audio because of the reasons I discussed, the use cases where you're out running or you are doing errands and you're just listening at double speed. Videos are consumed in a different way, though. I think videos also, there's great scope for intimate content. I have been planning for ages. In fact, I have another sort of trial recording set up tomorrow with a friend, and we want to do things for video. And a couple of the people here are kind of tearing whatever hair out is left, because I've been promising that for a long time. And but I'll try shorter formats, I'll throw things at the wall. I'll try different formats, whether it's conversation or whether it's a vlog with me solo, but just try different things, fully knowing that I'll suck at the start and it'll just take a lot of doing to kind of get better. But I think it's important to know what you're doing and why. Like, I remember twice a year I sometimes do a podcasting course which kind of covers the same territory as I covered in this webinar, but in a little more detail, where I sort of one of the participants of that course is a well-known author, and he had said ki I wanted to start a podcast. And then when I got chatting with him about why he wants to start a podcast, I realized that the purpose doesn't fit the form. And I told him, ki, boss, no, what you want to do is YouTube videos. You want to do 5-minute YouTube videos, not podcasting. And he agreed. And that was a correct fit for what he was doing. So it's important to sort of think about what is the correct fit for whatever you're doing. And to sort of come back to that for this kind of deep dive oral history kind of thing, I'm not certain that video is necessarily the right form, that it would inspire the same kind of honesty and candor from the people who speak to me. And logistically, it would just be really hard. And yeah, so these are the kind of reasons, but you will see me on video very, very soon, and I'll do a lot of different things, but not the seen and the unseen.
Understood. I've just switched off my video because I have internet issues, but continuing with questions, lots of questions about equipment and stuff. So I'm going to batch them, Amit. Simon Varghese says, please, can you repeat tip number 2? Irfan Mehraj asks, can you give us a basic must-haves in checklist and software? I think Amit has covered all of this, and you can find the recording on the ICFJ YouTube channel. So, but since people are asking, I'm just telling you anyway. I'm telling you, Amit. Someone asks, what are the free platforms for uploading podcasts? So that's 3 questions I've batched, and I'll batch a few more next time.
Yeah, I'm just going to tip number 2. Give me a moment. I don't think I need to share my screen again. I'll just go to tip number 2. And tip number 2, prepping is easier than fixing. Research all your choices. So prepping would be that if you're going to, say, someone's office or someone's house to record, don't just set up the mic and start recording immediately. Take some time to set it up, listen to it, listen to the sound. Sometimes there'll be an echo. Like I remember once I did a 3-person episode in my room, and I just got this new cupboard which has a sort of a glass sort of front, and everything else is pretty well insulated. I have these things behind me which you can see. I have really thick curtains. I have bookshelves which are great for insulating sound. But my friend who edits my show, Gaurav Gaurav asked that, did your guest number 3, which was Roshan Abbas in the last episode of last year, which I did with Roshan Abbas and Vikram Sate. So he asked, did Roshan have something glass behind him? And it turned out he did. And obviously we managed to fix it in post-production, but I hadn't caught it even despite my experience in my practice. And I was actually sitting and listening like this, that there was this weird kind of reverb which happened where, so we fixed that. But in general, fixing such stuff in post-production is really difficult. So for example, another common mistake that people can make with audio is that you'll put one mic in the middle and you'll record both of you on it, right? And like with the Blue Yeti, for example, you can fix a figure 8 pattern where it's recording both from the front and the back. And the problem with that is you have both the voices on one track. And if one person is louder and the other person is softer, and at times they are both speaking at the same time or interrupting each other, it gets really, really difficult to fix in post-production. So therefore, it's important sort of to have separate tracks for the 2 people. And if you cannot afford that, if you can just afford that one audio source, that's fine. But then listen to it and at least put it at a distance or figure it out that it's so that's what I mean by prepping is easier than fixing it. That if you half an hour of prepping before a recording can fix 10 hours of work in post-production where you can't fix it anyway. I did a remote episode with Krishi Shok once. The last time I used Zencaster at the time, because Zencaster messed up my sound. There was some software issue. It messed up my sound completely. My editor at the time, Vijay, did the best he could, but it's pretty bad. In fact, I apologize for it at the start of the episode. And since then, what I always do is I always take a backup. So if the the software fucks up, I have a backup there. And of course, I shifted from Zencaster to Squadcaster at that time. So little things that, the prepping kind of does matter. So it saves you time. And yeah. And what was the next question about equipment? Checklist.
Um, checklist,
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, so I'd say nothing, man. You can start with a smartphone, but otherwise, if you want a checklist, it depends on what kind of show you're doing. If it's a solo thing, you can start with a smartphone. You can start with one USB mic. If it is an interview thing that you're doing, you can go all the way from booking studios, like I used to do once upon a time before I booked my home studio. And when I go to Delhi and Bangalore, I have studios I use. But and they're very cheap, so it's like $1,000 an hour, 1,200 an hour. Especially in Bombay, if you just Google, like I remember there was one episode when the budget had just come out, and I was recording with Ajay Shah and Vivek Kaul, and but we had to do it the very next day, and my usual studio was booked, and at that time I didn't have a home studio, so I literally Googled, and the 22nd number I called was this dinky little place in Andheri for $1,000 an hour. And of course, I take 7-8 hours, but not everybody will. So they're pretty cheap. So you could just consider renting out a studio if you feel that your budget can afford that. Otherwise, if you want to build a home studio, the recommendations that I gave, um, the mic that I'm using right now is the Audio Technica 2100X, ATR 2100X. It's cost about 7,000. It's got both a USB and uh, whatever that thing is called. Jesus, I've forgotten. But that goes into your audio interface. I use a Zoom H6 for that, but you need not do that. You can just start with the mic, USB say connected to your laptop, and that's fine. Your editing software will be free if you use Audacity. Your hosting will be free if you use Anchor. So it's really easy to start. There's really no equipment excuse not to start if you want to.
And as Amit said, you can use your phone to begin with. Even if you don't have a mic, you can use your phone audio. You can just be yourself. So we started a podcast. It's called the Media Buddhi A to Z podcast. We've done about 10 episodes, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, I don't think we've cracked the formulation just yet. And if it's in the process of doing it, it took us several episodes just to get the audio right. There'd be some various vague sounds here and there. We just couldn't locate what the problem was. The room was too echoey. I had to put a towel underneath my laptop to ensure it absorbs sound. So I'm telling you, you'll encounter all kinds of things you can't anticipate. And the only way to get it right is to do some 50 episodes just to get your voice in, as Amit mentioned. So I just added that.
Couldn't agree
Um,
more. And I remember like 6 or 7 years back, I was, or right after I started The Seen and the Unseen, I also thought of doing a short format podcast with a friend with 3-minute episodes he'd release daily. And the show was called Pagal Kutte Ne Kaata Hai Kya? And it was a Hindi show where one of us would say something ridiculous and the other one would say Pagal Kutte Ne Kaata Hai Kya? And it would be like a short explainer on a subject. Really nice idea. We never did it. So the first time, so we recorded trials for that on my mobile phone. मतलब दोनों गाड़ी में बैठे थे when this idea came to us. And mobile phone बीच में रखा, and we just did some trial thing, and those audio files exist somewhere. So you don't need anything to start. Your phone है तो काफी है. उससे at least you can experiment and get a sense of what you'll sound like. So just start off.
And you mentioned the ethic of the creator economy, Amit. So I'm going to repeat what you've said yourself in your podcast episodes. The whole idea is not to aim for perfection, but you just get started. And people now understand the ethic is all over the place. They know that you're not going to get it right the first few times, but if you keep doing it, you'll get it right. Okay.
The slogan I really like for this is perfection is the enemy of production. If you chase perfection, nahi hone wala hai. Have a bias for action. Again, it's the same trade-off, getting it right versus getting it done. Have a bias towards getting it done, and the only way to get it right is really to get it done again and again and again. So just sort of jump into it. I think there was a social science experiment where two groups of people were asked to make a pot, and one group was or something, but let's say a pot for the purpose of this conversation, and one group was told you will make one pot, but you have a month to plan it, to learn about it, to research it and all that. At the end of that, you'll make one pot. The other group was told you can make as many pots as you want, minimum is 100, just like go for it. And obviously, as you would guess, the best pots came from the second group. Quantity led to quality. The first group planning kiya, came up with a mediocre pot. The first group started off with the other group started off with bad pots, but eventually they got to awesome pots. Like as Donald Trump would say, their pots were the best, right? In all caps. So quantity is often the route to quality. You only learn by doing. So just keep doing, keep iterating.
Great. Interesting question for me perspectively, personally also, which is Rusbe. Again, I apologize if I've not got your pronunciation right. Asks, I did not understand. I mean, okay, so the context is past, but they ask, given the centrality of voice in podcasts, do you have any recommendations about how to train the voice? Or is it not necessary to train the voice before starting a podcast? And I will add another question to it. What if, I'm worried that I have a squeaky voice, or,
Yeah.
a
So
voice.
Venkatesh,
You
you
may
have a
not have
great
that
voice.
problem, Amit, because they've got a deep voice, but a lot of people feel self-conscious about their voice.
Yeah. First of all, Venkatesh, you have a great voice. I love your voice, and you look awesome. Also, you're a complete hottie. But
Yeah.
to sort of to get to the question and not take a tempting digression, I'd say that this is completely a non-worry, because this is not radio where you're broadcasting and you need to have a radio presenter's voice. कि देखिए आज की सनसनीखेज खबर अमित वर्मा ने वेंकटेश को compliment दी. But instead, this is, remember, it's an intimate medium. Authenticity matters. Just be yourself, right? So forget about what your voice is like, forget about your accent, forget about your pronunciations. Everybody is human, yeah, everybody gets it. Podcasting in that sense is the opposite of Instagram. Like Instagram is so anxiety producing because you compare your real self with everybody else's projected selves, and of course you're never going to match up. But podcasting, in good podcasts, everybody is just themselves. People will relate to if you're just yourself. So don't worry. Like I mispronounce so many words because I'm half Bengali. I can't say, like, I pronounce THAT as dat. I've stopped thinking about all of these things. कि ठीक है, मेरी हो जाएगी pronunciation गलत, and I'll I'll have these tics and idiosyncrasies, and that's perfectly fine. But the point is, in podcasting, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your voice is. It doesn't matter what your accent is. Are you yourself, right? That's all that matters. So really just don't be self-conscious about this. And what would help you not be self-conscious about this is कि शुरू में यार कोई नया podcast सुनता ही नहीं है. So don't stress too much about it. Just keep doing it. Enjoy the process. Just focus on the process. It's like, Lord Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita that just do what you do. Don't think about the fruits of your actions. I think I must have paraphrased him wrongly, but forgive that. But yeah, just be yourself. It's cool. This is like such a non-worry that it's, yeah.
Yeah, I would, I think you paraphrased correctly if I'm not mistaken. But I also wanted to add that it's a non-worry. And I was going to say that when people do voice training, they say you can play around with the speed at which you speak. So within a sentence, you can speak fast and slow. You can play around with the tone of your voice. You can play around with the speed, the volume of your voice. That's more than enough. But honestly, even that is overrated.
I
That
have
comes from,
never done any of that. I don't even think about it, and neither do listeners. Yeah, once listeners are listening, if you do something artificial, they'll notice. It'll be contrived. But if you're just yourself, they'll adjust to that and just go with the flow.
yeah. And there's also this tendency we've seen. I don't know about other countries, but in India, in English, we've seen this tendency to put on an accent. There is no need for an accent. In fact, the more authentic your accent is, the better it is. Whether it's a Bengali pronunciation or a Kannadiga pronunciation or a Marathi or Tamil, or, whatever it is.
Don't be a
Okay,
Shoaib Akhtar.
right. Okay, so I'm not even going to get into explaining that joke, Amit, in the interest of time. But lots of questions still. So I'm going to pick just 3 or 4 more because I want to finish in 6 minutes. I know you've got time to go. Not time, I would say the energy and the willingness and the generosity to go on. But I think we will stop in about 6 minutes. Okay, so all the questions about equipment, I will not ask because it is in the recording that will be available on ICFJ's channel in a few in a few days, I would say, and you'll get the announcement as well. Some existential type questions. Okay, there's a question. Rohit asks, they're curious about your podcast's listenership. Can you share how many listeners you typically have? If you feel like answering, answer that, Amit. I'm going on to the other question. Pooja Rai asks, how can I start my podcast channel? Which is again, I think you kind of answered, but again, if you want to just start on the logistics of starting a channel, you can answer that question.
Yeah, so yeah, to answer the download, I get over 200,000 downloads or up to 250,000 downloads a month. I have no idea what those actually mean, or what it really translates to, and you can't just divide that by 4 and think that many per episode, because obviously there's a lot of binging that goes on when someone discovers a podcast of older episodes. But I don't, I mean, the engagement is off the charts, and I have no idea what those particular numbers mean in relation to other media, in relation to other audio podcasts. They're damn good, and I'm very fortunate to have gotten those kind of numbers. As far as what was the second part of your question? Sorry, the
how do you
logistics of setting up a channel. Yeah. So for an audio podcast, you can start it for free. I use something called Libsyn, but that's Libsyn, which is the biggest host, or at least used to be. I think it still is. But that's a paid service. And you pay per depending on the size of your files and all of that. But you can just start a free one at Anchor. So you can just go over to Anchor, which is owned by Spotify, and you can, it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's like setting up a blog. It's pretty easy, and I think that's a good way to start. If you're referring to a video podcast, um, I mean, I don't really know. I don't have lived experience of having done that. But again, my bias would be towards action, and in this case, do as I say, not as I do. But my bias would be towards action. That just start. Don't be too self-conscious, and it'll be fine. I hope that kind of helps. But I did mention the logistics a little bit. So if you watch the recording, maybe those will be helpful, or just you can reach out to me separately if you want.
Yeah, okay. So Kamran, for example, says there, thank you for your support, Amit. I'm uploading my first podcast now. I recorded
Congratulations,
last.
well done. Good luck. Good.
So that is the spirit in which we'd like you to start podcasts. Rusbe asks again, are you working with someone for editing and post-production? Would that be a recommendation? How much has to be paid for this on average?
So I work with an editor who's also a friend, who also owns a studio which I record at in Delhi, Gaurav Chintamani, and he's the bassist of a band called Advaita. We did an episode together called In a Silent Way, just I think 3-4 weeks ago, start of Feb. Yeah, so you can edit yourself actually. It's just that I do such long episodes, and it just made sense to kind of outsource that part of it. But you can edit yourself. It's not rocket science. And if you do get an editor, I think editors tend to charge between 1,000 to 1,500 bucks per hour of editing time. And editing time is normally double the duration of the actual thing. So it takes 2 hours to edit 1 hour of audio. I think it's something like that. So you could be paying 1,000 bucks per hour or whatever. So it's reasonably affordable. That's, I think, is around the market rate. Some may pay more, some may pay less. It kind of depends on what you're getting out of it. But if you feel that you can afford the professional help, then yeah, just hire an editor. But be clear about what you want, because, for example, someone like me wants the organic flow of the conversation to just go. So I might cut out gaps, or if the guest says, "Hey, let's have a glass of water, or let's take a break," that's all we'll cut out. The rest of it will be organic as it happened. That's the ethic of my show. But other shows might want a much crisper, cleaner sound. So an editor could then edit it crisply, cutting out all the uh, if somebody repeats something, cutting that out. Some people will even automatically cut out gaps between sentences, so everything sounds kind of quicker. I don't like that at all. My ethic is to keep it as natural as possible. So be clear about what kind of sound you want, and discuss that. with the editor. The editor can be an advantage because if you are editing in situations where noise is a problem, white noise comes in, and you don't know what to do with those, a good editor with good tools will be able to take care of some of those problems. But otherwise, learning yourself is not rocket science, and you can just go on Coursera or Skillshare, or even YouTube, and find resources to help you.
Excellent. So Bilal Handu asks, are there any sample podcasts? Can you suggest any podcast that can help storytellers? I'd say before Amit says anything, just listen to any one of Amit's episodes in the seen and unseen. Just Google it. I might mangle the URL. Amit will paste in
It's
the URL.
No, my URL is seenunseen.in, but I think the question was about a storytelling podcast, and I would strongly recommend Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. Brilliant because it is solo. That is a real power of storytelling. It is solo. He is talking like he talks. He's not, doing trying to project his voice or do things like that. He's just talking naturally, like you'd sit and talk to a friend. It's like a person thinking aloud, and it is riveting. I remember the first time I heard it, I had gone running outside, and I was listening at double speed, and it was Blueprint for Armageddon, which is like 25 hours, 5 episodes, 5 hours each, and I was listening at double speed. But even then, mera ek ghanta ho gaya, and it started raining, and I was still just standing outside under some shelter, still listening because I could not bear to stop listening. It's that good. So Dan Carlin's Hardcore History would be my top recommendation.
I think it was the zeitgeist. A few years ago, I listened to that episode too. I found it very difficult to tear myself away from it. But unfortunately, it's the only one episode of Dan Carlin's that I've listened to. I didn't even
They're
know.
all great, but they all require a fair amount of time to commit to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Bharat Nayak asks, can we change the background of the podcast after recording? So I don't know what that question means. I'm assuming it means background music. I don't know, but I'm moving ahead. Last couple of questions. Yeah.
If you mean the video podcast, probably not. But unless you use a green screen and you put something later, but otherwise it is what it is, I guess. But I would say.
Sorry, Amit, I interrupted.
Go ahead.
Just how do you record remote conversations? I think you referred to Zencaster earlier. And
Zencaster, I believe, is improved, but I don't use them anymore because of my bad experience. I use something called Squadcast. Squadcast, one word. And they're a bit expensive, but it's very reliable. And you can also record video on it if you want. Those are separate sort of programs, but they're quite reliable, and that's what I use. And what they do is each person's voice will be recorded on their own local computer, so the quality of the voice is as good as it can be, and then it gets uploaded to the cloud after the recording is over. But the thing is that the problem with remote recordings is that you can control the sound at your end, because presumably you'd have whatever basic equipment and you would have tried that out. But very often it's really hard to control the sound at the other person's end. So the important thing to remember is, one, insist that they use a headphone, because otherwise the noise from the speaker can bleed into their mic, and that can create an echo, and that you can't really sort that out in editing. So insist that they wear a headphone or an earphone. Ideally, they should use an external mic. If they don't have an external mic, then maybe a headset mic is fine, but just make sure there's no echo, there's no sound creeping in from then the headphone to the speaker if they're very close. And the third is avoid Bluetooth. Bluetooth is kryptonite for audio. So AirPods are amazing, but not for recording, not for something like this. I did an episode with Josie Joseph, which is fantastic, but the sound isn't incredible because he was using AirPods and I hadn't learned yet. As Venkatesh said, you never know everything at the start. You keep learning new things every time you do an episode. So that was my learning from that episode. Ki boss, it's a rookie error to use Bluetooth. So yeah, I mean, briefly, that's
cool. So we've answered 39, so I'll round it up to 40, which is a record. I've never had any. We've done this for years, but we've never had 40 questions answered. So is the podcast platform dependent? Vishwarajit asks.
No. So what will happen is, when you host a podcast, whether it's on a Libsyn or an Anchor, you're uploading it to one place, and then that podcast host, in my case Libsyn, will circulate it to all the podcast apps. So your show will be available on all podcast apps. So it is not platform dependent in that sense, nor is it dependent on Libsyn. If you start with Libsyn, that doesn't mean you can't shift it to Anchor or vice versa. You can shift your podcast at any time you want. And it should be available on all podcast apps. Now, initially, I didn't elaborate on this because we didn't have time, but I had a slide about how it's outdated technology, RSS feeds. When you start a podcast, it like takes an irritating amount of time for the RSS feed to be picked up by all the podcast apps. In some cases, you have to submit to Apple. You have to go, you submit your feed. Once Apple picks it up, some other guys will pick it up. Google Podcast has taken up to a month to pick up a feed. It's only for the first time. So what podcasters will often do, and what even I did, is they'll do an episode 0, which is like a 5-minute thing where they're just saying, this is a podcast we're doing, it's coming up. They upload that, so they have an RSS feed, wait for it to propagate or to all the podcast apps for everyone to pick it up. And sorry. And then after that process, they start from episode 1. So those kind of irritations are there, but those are irritations while starting. And I would imagine Anchor might have sorted out some of them because it's owned by Spotify, so at least it'll be there immediately on Spotify. And you can even use the Spotify link for the podcast as your homepage. I mean, I of course have a website of my own, but you don't actually need to do that. You can pick up the Apple podcast page or the Spotify page, and sorry, and just do those.
Great. I think we can stop there. This has been immense. Amit, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your learnings. And I would like to say that Amit does a podcasting thing. You can sign up for that as well. He does a series of seminars or workshops on the art of writing clearly. So that's a great place to start. Those are paid workshops. That's a way of kind of giving back what he gives to us for free. So, you'll find all the details on the website. We've pinged in. And I think you can follow him on Amit Varma. And Amit, I know you have a bugbear. I've known you for a while, I think. So it's VARMA, right? It's not the other spelling, right? So
yeah, the it's not the other spelling. It's VARMA. There is another spelling, but we won't mention it here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amit. Thanks everyone for being with us. We'll stop recording now. We've had a bulk of people hang out with us, which is amazing, which shows how